Well, the IFP's National Executive Committee is holding a press conference, a press briefing as we speak. There is a translation happening in isiZulu at the moment. But Velenkosini Hlabisa, the IFP leader, has been giving us a breakdown of the state of the party, of the national budget, of course, the contentious budget framework that was passed in Parliament just last week, and the role of the IFP in the government of national unity. Let's get you some analysis now. Professor Bheki Mngomezulu is a political science and international relations expert at Nelson Mandela University. Prof, it's great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on. What do you make of the IFP's own assessment of the party in the government of national unity? It says it is a voice of reason and integrity and brings constructive solutions to the GNU.
Good afternoon, Michelle, and good afternoon to our viewers. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it was almost a foregone conclusion that the IFP president, Mr. Velenkosini Hlabisa, was going to defend the decision by his party to support the 0.5 VAT increase. So we expected that to happen. But for me, there are two things that were glaring. The first one was when Minister Hlabisa said that as the IFP, they are going to hold government accountable. The question is which government? Because the IFP is part of the coalition government made up of 10 political parties. So then parties that have a right to say that they are going to hold government accountable are those that are not forming part of the coalition. That was the first thing. Then the second most important thing was the one he said later in his presentation when he said that they've approached the president asking him to convene a special cabinet meeting wherein two issues are going to be discussed, one of which is to increase, basically to increase the economy of the country, and then, of course, to try and create jobs. The question then will be, why didn't they do this before the budget speech? Because we knew all along that these things were on the table, and why now, after there's been an outcry following this 0.5% VAT increase? So those are the two clearing points for me. The rest, he was factually correct. But then in terms of the analysis of the situation, I think the most important point we wanted to make was that the IFP has retained its identity. Of course, we can debate that.
We certainly can, because one of the other statements he made was that the IFP is an anti-VAT increase party. It sounds like a case of wanting to have your cake and eat it too. You can't be anti-VAT and also vote alongside the ANC for a 0.5 percentage point hike.
Yeah, there are some contradicting messages, and that is bound to happen. In fact, it's the same situation that we find in case of the DA, where the DA will take the same government to court when they are part of the government. So that is why I always use this term that there is an identity crisis at work here, where parties don't seem to understand that they are no longer opposition parties, they are part of the collective. In other words, they are government. So you cannot be talking about government as a separate entity when you are actually part of the government. So the point here is that there is an outcry about the increase of a VAT, whether by 0.5% or by 1% or by 2%. The point is there is VAT increase. And the president of the IFP is correct in saying that the entire budget is not about VAT, but there are other issues which, in his view, are positive. That is factually correct. But the bone of contention here is VAT. Where do you stand on the issue? The answer is very simple. You voted in favor of the increase of VAT by 0.5%, and then at the same time you say you are against VAT increase. Why didn't they talk about trimming the government, for example? We have 400 members of parliament, and then we have a big executive, and then in some instances we even have more than one deputy ministers. Why not start there, and then we can talk about VAT at a later stage?
Well, the argument has been repeatedly from various quarters that cutting R1 billion or cutting part of that R1 billion, which is the cost of the cabinet, won't go any way to alleviating the debt crisis the country finds itself in. Is that a good argument?
Michelle, if you are in a crisis situation, every contribution makes. I mean, every contribution you make matters. In this case, if you can reduce the deficit by 1 billion rand, so be it. Then once that is done, then we move to other issues. In other words, you cannot have one issue which you say this is a panacea to our crisis, but we have to bring together a combination of factors, one of which is the one that I'm citing, that our cabinet is bloated. And then, of course, the president had said that he was going to reduce cabinet, but he did the direct opposite of that. Why are we not talking about that as one of the many factors? Not to say it's the only factor, but it's one of the critical factors that will, at least in the eyes of the public, will indicate that government is serious about addressing our economic crisis.
Absolutely.
At the moment.
Perception is everything, isn't it? I want to talk more about this identity crisis that members of the GNU do face, Professor Mngomezulu, because they want to, it certainly appears, they want to be in government, but they also want to be those holding government to account. Yes, we need oversight from the inside, but you have to at some point admit that the oversight also needs to be on you as one of the 10 parties in the GNU.
You are absolutely right, Michelle. In fact, for me, the first thing that needs to happen is to bring the leaders of these political parties under one roof and educate them about what a coalition government is to start with. Because the terminology itself is a problem. To call it a GNU, that is where the first problem starts. This is not a GNU, it's a multi-party coalition. That is the first thing that needs to happen. And they must understand that and understand fully what the difference is between a GNU and a multi-party coalition. They mustn't confuse this with what happened in 1994, because the one in 1994 was a GNU by virtue of the fact that it was premeditated and it was in fact captured in the interim constitution of 1983. So it's something totally different. The ANC won the election convincingly, 62% to be exact, but they still formed the coalition because it had already been agreed prior to the election taking place in April 1994. What we have now is something totally different. Then for me, that is the first point. Then the second point will be to say that up until the 6th administration, you had the ANC being the governing party, and then the other parties were opposition political parties, with the DA being the main opposition. This is no longer the case in the 7th administration. The majority of these parties are now part of government, so they can no longer behave as though they are still on the opposition benches. They are government. So you cannot then come and say you are going to hold government accountable. Which government are you going to hold accountable?
Yeah.
Because you are government. And then, which is the same point I was making earlier on, that for the DA to take government to court, they are basically taking themselves to court in practical terms. That's what it means. So that is where the identity crisis then comes in.
Well, I suppose then you might agree with Paul Mashatile, the Deputy President, when he was speaking this morning, and he said he would have been ashamed to be a minister in this government of national unity and to report for duty when you voted no for the budget framework that was passed last week. Is that a fair assessment?
No, I usually disagree with many of these politicians, but I listened to the Deputy President, who was absolutely on point, because then it will be difficult for the ministers that come from the DA, for example, to implement a budget they've opposed during the voting process. Because now it means that you are part of this government, but at the same time, we are not part of this government. It just doesn't make sense. So on that one, the Deputy President was absolutely right. That's why I was saying that the DA should be ashamed of itself. Of course, we know that all these ministers are no longer belonging to political parties. Technically, they are appointed by the president, invoking Section 84 of the Constitution. But the fact that they report to their own political parties, meaning that that is where they derive mandate, under normal circumstances, that shouldn't be the case. Cabinet must take a cabinet decision. I mustn't take a decision in cabinet based on what my party says. I must take a cabinet decision because I am a member of cabinet as appointed by the president. So that is one other area where I think the module on political education on these politicians will have to take place. Yeah,
there seem to be so many blurred lines. And I wonder what you think, Professor Mngomezulu, the fact that it is a government of national unity, right? This is not a coalition that translates to the provinces. And we see that in the way that the provinces are run. And even as an analyst yourself, I'm sure at times you have to say, in Tshwane, this is the coalition. It's not necessarily the national coalition. It's different in Tshwane. It's different in Gauteng. And it's going to play out even more so with the local government elections next year, isn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, depending on what happens between today and the weekend, some of the changes that happen at a national level will have a direct impact on what happens in some provinces, more especially in KwaZulu-Natal. Because you recall that the first media statement that the IFP released following the May 2024 general election was that they had clinched a deal with the DA and the ANC at a national level. But then he went on to say that the agreement at national level does not have any bearing in the provincial government. But in the same media statement, he said that as the IFP, we have already submitted the name of Mr. Tamintuli to be the premier candidate, and the ANC and the DA have already agreed to support us. So already there was a problem there. I remember talking to some of your colleagues saying that there is something missing here. On the one hand, we are saying that the agreement at a national level has no bearing at a provincial government level. But at the same time, we are saying that we have already agreed that the premier candidate for the IFP has already been given a nod by both the ANC and the DA. So that is some of the issues that in fact brought us to where we are. So if any change were to happen at a national level in this multi-party coalition of 10 political parties, that will then have a direct impact on what happens in KwaZulu-Natal. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, the DA either walks away or is kicked out by the ANC. The DA is one of the parties that propelled the IFP to take over the province of KwaZulu-Natal from the MK party, which had garnered more than enough votes compared to other political parties. So then if that were to happen at a national level, then it would mean that in KwaZulu-Natal, there might then be a change. And that is not something that I think these political parties seem to be aware of.
Certainly, it doesn't appear so. Professor Bheki Mngomezulu, it's always a pleasure talking to you, sir. Thanks very much for giving us your analysis. That IFP briefing still ongoing in Durban. Velinkosini Hlabisa giving us an update on a whole range of things, but particularly the state of the party and its role in the government of national unity.